get great. So I'll just start. Welcome. Thanks for coming today. My name is Jonathan Hedinger, and I am the Communications Director for the Park County Environmental Council. Thrilled to host another community conversation today, which is a part of our ongoing series about community planning and the tools that we use to address growth in our community. The last couple community conversations have focused on the Park County Draft Housing Action Plan. We're really excited to see so much engagement in this plan and hoping to address one of this critical issue in our community. If you've missed either the overview of the Draft Housing Action Plan conversation or our last conversation about community land trust, you can find that on PCEC's YouTube. Today, we're talking more about housing and taking a deep dive into one solution in the Housing Action Plan, which is short-term rental regulations. We're thrilled to be joined by some great partners from HRDC and Ben Davis of the Whitefish City Commission. I'm going to do a quick introduction about PCEC, and then I'll pass it over to our guests. So as always, today's presentation is recorded and it'll be shared on our website. I think it's now live on Facebook too. As a Zoom reminder, please mute your computer and be respectful of speakers. If you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll go through them or call on you at the end and see kind of where we end up. So PCEC is your community conservation group. We have 650 contributing members and more than 3,000 supporters here in Park County. We work to safeguard the land, water, wildlife, and communities in Yellowstone's Northern Gateway through grassroots organizing and advocacy. Park County is the traditional homeland and current home to many indigenous peoples, including the Absaloka or Crow tribe. And Park County today has a long tradition of human habitation of people who love, cherished, and stewarded this place. We are committed to working together to honor this legacy and this place for future generations. We've been hosting these Zoom conversations about growth and planning in our community for the past several years. And our goal is to help us all learn and gain a shared understanding of some of the most pressing issues we face as a community, which is why we're here to talk about housing today. And you may wonder why a grassroots conservation group cares about housing. Well, we believe that taking care of people in our community is central to our mission and our values. And we believe that the people need safe and affordable housing in order for our community to thrive. We believe that learning to grow together, creating thoughtful development that consolidates growth in our urban footprints is good for our human and non-human community members. On a personal level, it's been really hard to live here. I've moved 8 different times in 3 years, and I don't think that's sustainable for any community member. And ultimately, I don't think we can do long-term conservation in this community if we don't work together on housing. While some might think that no growth is the best approach, I don't think that's realistic or equitable. We've been seeing more and more people move to our community because it's an incredible place. We have access to incredible natural amenities, public lands, the Yellowstone River, Yellowstone National Park. We're seeing a boom in both recreation and residential development here. This trend has been happening for many years, but it's been accelerated with some shocking changes in the housing market in the past year, making it harder and harder for people that live here to keep on living here. We believe that working together, we can build the vision for the community we want to become, rather than just letting the growth happen to us. And if you think that sounds good, please go to our website, join our mailing list, or get involved today. Now's a great time to donate to PCEC because we have a match on donations through the end of the year. So I guess first, I just wanted to pass the microphone to Lila Fleishman from HRDC to kind of talk about how we got here and why we're talking about short-term rental regulations as a part of the draft Park County Housing Action Plan.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. I'm Lila Fleishman, Project Manager, Community Development at HRDC, and I've been leading a lot of the work around Park County housing planning, including the draft housing action plan. I'm going to put a comment or a link in the chat if you would like to go review that. There is a short survey that would be really helpful for people to fill out after they've reviewed the documents. I had a couple slides, but first I'm just going to kind of mention, in context of the draft housing action plan, which is available online in its draft form. We're not here to dictate an exact policy around short-term rentals. Short-term rental regulation came up as a really popular idea of something to be explored and implemented in the county and the city of Livingston. We're advocating that the community take a moment to stop and reflect on the impact of short-term rentals and see how this could be an opportunity to promote community values. The growth of the industry of short-term rentals has been very rapid and things have changed very quickly, as in many communities around the country. So we encourage the city of Livingston and Park County to be intentional about managing short-term rentals in line with their values. So we're here to collect some information, to have a conversation and learn from one another about what the community values around creating a policy that would help consider short-term rentals as a way to represent community values. Let's see if I can share my screen without knocking off. Okay, is that somebody give me a nod? I think it's not in presentation mode. Nope. Sorry, I was trying to present to a meeting I'm not in. I'll just leave it where it is. I wanted to highlight a couple of pieces from the 2021 Housing Needs Assessment. Short-term rentals in Montana are defined as lasting fewer than 30 days. I won't read the whole slide to you, but I worked to find some information about where short-term rentals exist. There's a couple different sources. So this one came from a company called Granicus. They're a technology company that uses their private data. So there's a little bit of a mismatch between the numbers if you're looking at something like AirDNA or just popping on to Airbnb. But one of the really important things to highlight that seems to be true of any source that you look at is that Park County is a really popular place for short-term rentals. It's also a place where the number of short-term rentals compared to the number of households is, I believe, the second highest in the state. So looking at the impact that short-term rentals may have on communities is an interesting thing to prepare ourselves to have the conversation with. So I estimated at around 6.7% of the homes are being used for short-term rentals. And that's kind of a large percentage of homes when we're talking about having so many challenges of accessing housing. So there's a high number of short-term rentals. I also wanted to put together a little bit about in Park County, the average per night is $243. So thinking of that from the perspective of somebody operating a short-term rental as just one or as a business is still, there's a lot of work that needs to be put in, but there's a lot of money moving through that system. And
I think you could just hit the present button on the top, and then it was a little hard to see some of those figures.
All right. I started presenting to a meeting I didn't join. So
it's just to the left of that yellow share button. No, go just one more to the right. To the right. Yeah. Right there. Yeah.
Everyone's faces were in my way. Sorry about that. Okay. So this was the first slide if anyone wants a better look. And then just the last slide, when we're talking about creating an ordinance, as I mentioned, it's a representation of community values. So we want to talk about what the vision for that may be, as well as the lens that we will be taking to develop the ordinance. With that, I forgot that I was going to do a couple polls. I'm just going to launch this poll right now so that we can see kind of who's in the room when we're discussing short-term rentals. Getting a lot of good responses. We have 46 participants, so that's a lot of people. And then I think for you to see it, I need to end the poll. Give everyone just another couple seconds. All right, can everybody see the poll? I'm gonna assume that's a yes. So it looks like nobody owns more than one short-term rental in this conversation. A large amount of people are not even interacting with short-term rentals at all. And a lot of people have used them in their experience. And then we have one more poll about the values, and I'll turn it over to Ben.
Hey, Lila, we can't see the polls on our end.
It looks like some people can see the polls. I'm not sure how they're doing that, but I'm seeing folks say they're seeing the poll in the chat as well.
I think people can see the poll, they just can't see the results. And Tori says that you can share results after you get them.
All right, maybe I just moved on too quickly. Okay, if we share results. So when we look at who in the room is looking at, we're looking at poll number 2 right now. So for poll number 1, I'll just quickly summarize. A few people had one short-term rental. Maybe I didn't leave it open long enough, but nobody responded that they had multiple short-term rentals. Most people have stayed and used them to stay with their friends and family. And then 24% of people polled did not engage with short-term rentals. Looking at the slide, asking for audience feedback about values for short-term rentals and what you would hope for a policy to accomplish. We have 75% are looking to preserve housing for residents. Nobody's top priority was to regulate the safety, 11% at other, and then 4% want to reduce noise complaints. And that's really helpful to me, so I appreciate everybody filling that poll out. I'm excited to hear from Ben about what's been happening up in Whitefish, where they've had a lot of experiences around having these conversations and trying different things in the community. So thanks for joining us. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via email about the Housing Action Plan and review those documents online. Thanks.
Great. And yeah, so our next speaker is Ben Davis of the Whitefish City Commission. He's also chair of the Whitefish Housing Steering Committee and former chair of the Whitefish Housing Authority Board. But by day, Ben is the owner of Seven Hills Construction, a general contractor that primarily focuses on custom homes with various professional experience in finance and real estate. And Ben's going to talk to us about what Whitefish is doing about short-term rental regulations and give us a little bit of history of how it's and how those regulations are structured in Whitefish. So Ben, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. It's great to see everybody and happy to talk about Whitefish and short-term rentals, two of my favorite topics. So I thought I'd start this conversation with a couple statistics that I know have come up in our council meetings of late that tend to raise some eyebrows on our side. So the first is that in the Whitefish zip code 59937, short-term rentals have 1,271 active listings that average 2.3 bedrooms, which equates to over 2,900 guest rooms. By this calculation, there are twice as many short-term rental guest rooms as traditional lodging guest rooms within the Whitefish zip code. And if you consider the fact that short-term rentals have only been around in any substantial amount in, I don't know, the last 5 years or something like that, you know, what we've seen on our side is a basically exponential growth of visitor beds here in the Whitefish area, and that's caused a lot of issues with residents here. So just to kind of set the stage of Whitefish, I mean, obviously you're probably familiar, but we have around 8,000 full-time residents. We are in Flathead County. Big Mountain, the ski hill, is not in the city of Whitefish, it is in the county. There are two different regulation regimes, one within the city and one within the county. So you do have a fairly substantial number of short-term rentals in the city. You also have a decent number that are out in the county, and the regulations tend to be totally different, quite honestly. That's something we get to deal with. So just to touch on the political environment here. So, there is a lot of development of short-term rentals happening here in town. Short-term rentals have mixed feelings amongst the residents here. I mean, one important context of the conversation is affordable housing. So as you've mentioned here, there are a lot of concerns about how short-term rentals impact affordable housing. I mean, here, the difference between the income that a property owner can make as a short-term rental is substantially different than what it is as a long-term rental, as it is in a lot of places. But it's important to understand that we also talk about it in two different contexts here. One is affordable housing, but the other is something that we have been talking about lately, which is overvisitation. And overvisitation is a word for a feeling that we have here, in particular following the COVID era that we're in now, which is the fact that we have had an unbelievable number of visitors here in town, more than any time in the past. It's caused businesses having issues even just keeping up with it. And there's a lot of folks in town who kind of feel like at some point, my goodness, when can the roads and the infrastructure simply not handle any more visitors? And so we call that overvisitation. And we actually have a committee called the Sustainable Tourism Management Committee who's looking at ways to keep our community sustainable in the face of kind of an overwhelming number of visitors here in town. So short-term rentals come up in two different contexts, because it comes up in the housing context, and it comes up in the context of overvisitation related to that statistic I described earlier, where we have basically an exponential growth in the number of visitation beds available here. So we have a Sustainable Tourism Management Committee, as I mentioned before, who is looking at the sustainability of tourism here in town. We also have affordable housing plans and boards and things that are probably in some ways similar to I think some of the things you were alluding to a minute ago. So the current regulation regime here, we're very fortunate in Whitefish that starting at some point in the 80s, there were specific zoning districts set up to accommodate short-term rental property. We call those resort zoning. And just to take a wild guess, I would speculate it's probably somewhere around 20% of the land area within the city of Whitefish is actually zoned for short-term rentals. So those include resort residential zones, and those also include like business areas, business districts. So that would include downtown and some of the business commercial strips that come out of downtown. And I think it's safe to say, if we look at the development patterns in town, that pretty much anything that can be built as a short-term rental is. And short-term rentals have been a catalyst for substantial development in town, including, for example, in our commercial core in downtown. You have retail strip, on Central Avenue, for example. And if you look at what's happening, is every floor and every space that can be added above that is being added to or built to accommodate more short-term rentals. And the development economics are such that that's actually driving a substantial amount of the property value and development activity that you're seeing in those areas. With mixed feelings from the residents, honestly. I mean, I would say that, quite frankly, there's a lot of residents that really kind of question how much all of this does for our town. I mean, it's, Whitefish is a tourist town in some respects, that we do have a lot of visitors, but I wouldn't call it a tourist town, because we have a lot of full-time residents who care very deeply and live and work here. And so, there are a lot of folks who may feel that a lot of this development economy is not servicing the needs of the folks that are here, hence a lot of our conversations at the council level. So just to recap, what we've been done and are looking at, and as far as regulation goes, a couple of months ago, we extensively debated and ultimately voted down a short-term rental moratorium, which was effectively a halt on the issuance of new short-term rental licenses. And in that same conversation was the concept of a cap of some sort of how to add a cap on the number of short-term rentals here in town, or by zoning district, or however you want to look at it. We did ultimately vote that down for a couple reasons. It does feel like the situation here in a lot of ways with respect to housing and short-term rentals are a part of that conversation, is five-alarm fire as far as we look at it. But ultimately we didn't feel like there was a very clear path of what we would actually be able to do, at least in the time period that we had to work with a moratorium. And additionally, a moratorium on rental licenses is not a moratorium on development that accommodates short-term rentals. And ultimately, that was not going to stop, at least in our view. I think that, but the other thing is with license, when we talk about license caps, which is, the idea that we can't endlessly accommodate new short-term rentals here in town. Again, thankfully, because it's only zoned in certain parts of town, that is effectively our cap here. So if 20% of the land is available for short-term rentals, then that's the cap. That's where they can go. And I think a lot of our efforts have focused more on trying to keep them there in that 20%. And there's a lot of, for various reasons over time, there's been areas or projects that have obtained short-term rental or licenses or grandfathered or various things outside of those zoning districts, and we're trying to avoid that going forward. And we're trying to prevent folks from creating short-term rentals where they're not supposed to be. So related to that, there are a couple of regulations that we are in the process of potentially adopting. And I say that because they are currently proposed. In fact, this short list I'm going to run through, we were debating at our council meeting on Monday. We did not finish, and we will continue at our next council meeting. But that short list is mostly related to enforcement. So like I said, trying to contain the short-term rentals in the portion of land that they're designed to be in. Those efforts are to change the definition of a short-term rental from 30 days to 90 days. So we have noticed that there are a decent number of properties in town who would be furnished for 30 days at a time. And, you'll get folks who want to rent them for 2 weeks and leave them vacant for 2 weeks. And, there are some complicating legal issues to this as it relates to the Landlord Tenant Act at the state level. And there are, I'm not going to go extensively into this debate, but there are a few drawbacks to it, and that we're working through right now. But ultimately, I think long-term zoning districts are intended to be long-term, and I think that's how everybody sees them, and that's what we're trying to keep them as. The second regulation change is requiring a license number in the listing. So we have also noticed that there are various illegal short-term rentals in town. Folks who, we pull them up in our council meetings. You can go and look, and there's one right there in my neighborhood. And so they're out there, and so we would like to avoid that. So we are going to start requiring license numbers in the listings. I know when I took a vacation recently to Hawaii, actually they did the same thing, and so you can kind of see here's the license number and the business license, and that way it allows us to know that is a legal short-term rental. And the third would be to increase the licensing fees. So we formerly had license fees for short-term rentals were their business licenses is kind of the same as opening a small business. They were like $40 a year, but we realized that the amount of staff time and city bandwidth consumed by short-term rentals is far in excess of that. So we did increase the license fees here in Whitefish to, I believe it was around $400 per year. And part of the reason for that is to is number 4, which is to look at the available third-party options for enforcement. So we have found, code compliance is nobody's favorite job, and especially here in the city of Whitefish, we are perpetually short-staffed in our planning and zoning areas these days. And so we are looking at potentially hiring a third party to identify any illegal short-term rentals and allow us to follow up with them. And I think some of those efforts are intended to help cover that. Now that is enforcement. I mean, I do feel like enforcement has its place, but I would also, say that's just one part of the picture. I don't hang my hat on the fact that that's going to solve any significant housing issues here in town. So there are a couple things that we are evaluating for the future for short-term rentals. I will tell you just straight up politically, we are going through another a sequence of growth planning here. We're updating our city's master growth policy here actually next year. And I will tell you for sure that there will be no expansion of land available for short-term rentals at any point. But in other things, we have been considering possibly taxation of short-term rentals, honestly, to help with long-term housing initiatives. So, there is a lot of folks who would feel, including myself, that when we consider the causes of our housing crisis here in Whitefish, this is definitely a part. The visitation economy is a big part of it, and just in the efforts of fairness, we're looking around trying to find funding of ways to help our businesses have place for employees to stay open, and we ask ourselves where should this funding come from, and what's a fair way to do it, and part of the answer, in my opinion, does come from the visitation economy, and so we are looking at ways to do that. Although I will say that taxation options under state law in Montana are pretty limited. So there's a bed tax that already exists. I believe it's about 8% that is set up by the state, and most of that goes to the state. We are not able to change or expand that. We have not. We've kind of looked at bed taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, basically ways to ask for folks who are involved in the visitation economy to help pay for some of the other problems that it's created. And we don't have a solution yet, but if anybody has a good one, I'd love to hear about it. And that's something that we're very much looking at. And we also have some budding efforts we have in our strategic housing plan, which is our list of initiatives we're doing with respect to housing. One of the strategies identified in that plan is short-term rental buyback program, which I know is very similar, in fact, to one that was recently implemented in Bozeman area, I believe. And so that came up recently in one of our meetings. And that consists of offering financial incentives to short-term rental property owners to rent long-term and to help offset the cost of the difference in income that you would otherwise make. And so, yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary of where we are. Like I said, if anybody's got better ideas, we're all for them. It is a fast developing issue as far as I'm concerned. I mean, nobody cared about short-term rentals, it seems like a couple of years ago. And, recently Whitefish was in the top 10 trending Airbnb visitation areas, which much to our consternation. And it is a pretty rapidly developing situation. I mean, I think some stability is hopefully needed and hopefully will come. And we'll see how it goes. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thanks, Ben. It's really great to hear about what we could be doing and what some of those solutions are and kind of how they're working and things like that. And I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. So thank you very much. And some people might be wondering why we had to ask someone not from the community to come talk about this. Well, right now, Park County doesn't really do anything to regulate short-term rentals. I know that I talked with the health department because they are working to register a lot of the short-term rentals right now, but they know that there are hundreds that exist that don't have the proper registration or anything like that. And the only current fee associated with it is a $40 fee to the health department to help get that registered. And Whitefish, Flathead County, has the highest number of short-term rentals in the state. But actually Park County has the second most per 100 households, with 1 out of 10 households being a short-term rental in Park County. So I guess next I will introduce Mathieu Menard of the City of Livingston to kind of talk about what options we could have, or just kind of give a summary of how, now that this is in the draft housing action plan, what process is possible to use going forward. So Mathieu, would you be able to talk about that?
Yeah, and I'll try to be pretty quick here. I think Ben did a really good job of covering a lot of the options on the regulatory side of things. Just a disclaimer to start out with, I'm, as a city employee, I'm not advocating for any of these specifically. I'm not speaking really from the city perspective here. I'm just gonna speak from a planning perspective and sort of give you some options that places have used and sort of what the background is on short-term rentals. So I don't want to see a headline in the paper tomorrow that says I'm advocating for some sort of short-term regulation. Basically, with short-term rentals, you can sort of run the whole gamut of what cities will do, anywhere from incentivizing them to banning them outright. So there's a lot of different options and a lot of different things that cities have taken depending on what their intent is with why they're regulating short-term rentals. Some of that, as you've seen in the poll that Lila put up, safety, noise, nuisance, impact on neighborhoods, impact on housing. And you hear a lot about, well, all the houses in the neighborhood now are short-term rentals, so we don't really have a community, we don't have a neighborhood. Obviously, there's a flip side to that. Those are all seen as negatives. There are some positives that people will argue, and this issue is very split between people. Having a short-term rental in your backyard is an income generator for homeowners. So potentially it does make homeownership more affordable for people in the community. It also does generate tourism income and is seen as an economic development tool. If you have shops, coffee shops, restaurants downtown, and you have Airbnbs, those people are visiting the restaurants. So there are positives and negatives to short-term rentals. I don't want this to be all seen from the negative side, but they certainly do have an impact on our housing market, which is why we're here today. So that should be noted as well. Ben covered a lot of these, but some of the regulatory options that we've seen in other places, limiting the number of Airbnbs or short-term rentals in the city, limiting the location, which is what Ben was talking about, where they only allow them for specific locations in the city. Just a general permitting process. Again, Ben talked about the $400 fee that Whitefish has recently implemented. A lot of cities will place rules on Airbnbs that you have to just display somewhere in the rental, things like noise, hours, whether or not you can have outdoor parties, who the people are to call if there's an emergency, that type of thing. As Ben discussed very nicely, enforcement is hugely difficult with short-term rentals. Often those calls go to the police and you end up having a lot of police calls for short-term rentals, which is basically increasing costs on the city. As Ben talked about, code compliance is not only a difficult job, there's not a lot of people that want to do it. Currently, the city of Livingston has one code compliance officer. I think Park County is working on hiring a code compliance officer. So it's tough to do code enforcement. Other regulations that we've seen, owner occupancy rules. So basically that would be, if you're going to have a short-term rental, you need to live somewhere on the property or have a long-term rental somewhere on the property. Conditional use permits are obviously a hot topic in Park County. Some places have used conditional use permits to evaluate short-term rentals on a case-by-case basis. That is an option through the regulations. Limit the type of buildings you can have short-term rentals in. If you look at AirDNA, which is sort of a short-term rental information site that aggregates from a lot of short-term rental websites, most of the short-term rentals in the city of Livingston, kind of unusually, are full single-family homes. So potentially not allowing an Airbnb or short-term rental to be in that full single-family home, limiting them to something like an accessory dwelling unit is certainly a possibility. These are obviously all regulatory. They're limiting the amount of short-term rentals or where you can put them or something like that. There are financial programs that places have put in place to try to either incentivize or disincentivize. More often we'll see disincentivize. State taxation policies. There are certainly states that have higher property taxes for out-of-state owners. It's not something that's probably very plausible in Montana right now. It'd be something to lobby the state for. Incentivizing long-term rentals in some way. Again, that could come through public funding, or as Ben mentioned, the community of Big Sky using their resort tax dollars, which is something that the city of Livingston doesn't have and most of Park County doesn't have, but the community of Gardner does have access to. The Big Sky's basically been paying the difference between the cost or the income from long-term rentals and short-term rentals, and they've flipped quite a few rentals in Big Sky to long-term from short-term by doing so. It's been a huge amount of money outlay for them to do that, but it's certainly something you could do. I should note Big Sky isn't its own city. It's part of Gallatin County. And kind of like Whitefish, there's two jurisdictions. The actual resort of Big Sky is in Madison County. But that's worked really well using their resort tax dollars. And that goes through the resort tax board. So it's certainly an option for someone like Gardner. There are also private campaigns to just try to inform citizens on, here's the impact of the community if you do a short-term rental versus a long-term rental. Again, that will usually run through private entities, chambers of commerce's, boards, whoever it is. It's usually not coming from the city side of things. Private entities, especially when you do a subdivision or a condo development, can put what are called covenants on the property. A lot of developments now are placing covenants that say no short-term rentals because it's not something a lot of homeowners want to see in their neighborhood. So encouraging those through when developers go through the condo or the subdivision development. The process for getting any of these done, it depends on what you're looking at. Short-term rentals, as Ben alluded to, are very controversial. There are positives and negatives to them. I don't think anyone's going to argue that it's a clear-cut issue. There's a lot of gray zone in there, and you'll have a lot of differing opinions on what should be done with them, if anything at all. So the process on a regulatory side would be an ordinance change. That would be something that would be driven by your commissioners generally. So citizens telling their commissioners that they want some sort of action on short-term rentals is the way to get that process started. Private organizations can always act in the short-term rental market. Again, Big Sky is a great example of this. So mobilizing people like the Chamber of Commerce to do information or educational campaigns, to try to drive money in certain directions, to try to do outreach to convince short-term rental renters to swap to long-term rentals is a very effective process that you don't have to go through the bureaucratic process of the government. And often those chambers of commerces have large emailing lists and obviously are important members of the community that can make a big change. Again, entities like PCEC, Park County Community Foundation, same kind of concept there. There are financial options in the state. They're very limited. As Ben noted, Whitefish, I believe, also has resort tax. Gardner has resort tax. Gardner could certainly be using resort tax to do some sort of incentive to not have short-term regulation. And then we talked about it a little bit. Enforcement is always a challenge. The more rules you place on anything, the more enforcement you're going to need to have people follow those rules. It's very difficult, it's very expensive. So anytime you do any sort of short-term rental regulating, you really do need to think hard about how it's going to be enforced, who's enforcing it, what the costs are. Or understand the possibility that people may break the rules even if you make them, and it's going to be very hard to enforce those. And Ben did a great job covering, how their commission is discussing that over and over again. It's a challenge for all towns, especially in Montana, where you don't generate a lot of revenue, and you generally have very small staffs that are dealing with these types of things. Some of the costs, as Ben noted, can be covered by permitting fees. It's certainly a possibility. You probably can't generate revenue in the state of Montana through permitting fees, but you can certainly cover some of your costs for short-term rentals. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer questions on processes, what places I've done, what are regulatory options, what are other options. Hopefully that covered what you're looking for, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. And I know this is a controversial topic. So again, we just asked Matthew to speak about what's possible and what could be done. And I think that what we're really hoping kind of comes out of the draft housing action plan and this process is feedback from community members on what we could be doing and how that might work and things like that. And Lila has a survey on the housing action plan that we would appreciate everyone could fill out if they can to kind of give feedback on what some of those tools might be. I guess, yeah, we're happy to answer questions now. I was thinking, Lila, I was kind of interested in Michael DeChellis's question about what do we know about the short-term rentals that are occurring in Livingston and Park County? Are they second homes that are rented out full-time? Are they rented out part-time? I guess, do we have any, what's the best information we have right now?
Yes, it's a good question. I think that there was potentially a little bit in the needs assessment. And the majority of homes in Park County are single family. So I'm fairly sure that that's kind of what we're going to see, but I'll have to find that specific information. If you couldn't tell from me missing buttons before, I'm looking at this in a very small screen. So some of those things get missed. I don't know if I have quite enough data in front of me to appropriately answer that question. So I'll see if I can find it and I'll put it in the chat, but I'll let us move on to other people's questions.
Okay, great. And that's what I guess I was thinking. Jerry Ladowig had a question. How do we reach the outside people who are buying and building here with the VRBO and dollar signs in their eyes? She said it's happening in Glastonbury where she lives. And I know we've kind of heard that anecdotally that that's being touted as a really good investment. I don't know if anyone has any ideas. I know Matthew kind of mentioned that we could do a private campaign just educating people, but I guess, Ben, how do you handle that in Whitefish?
Sorry, is the question, how do you reach developers who?
How do you reach people that are investing in the community or that are outside of the community and just buying up Airbnbs, or is that really even happening there?
Well, it's tricky. I mean, we are a small town and there are, I mean, quite candidly, there's a fairly limited number of folks who do a lot of the development here in town. In my opinion, a good real estate developer is somebody who takes into account the needs and desires of the community in the process. And we do have several of those here, but I don't count on it. I mean, it's capitalism here, just like it is everywhere. And I do think that generally speaking, folks are going to do what's in their best interest, or you can at least assume that. And so, I know that, when we deal with development approvals here at the council level, this comes up in particular in various ways, and we do interact with the developers there. Anybody we know or we try to encourage to consider the needs of the community, and generally speaking, if a project comes in with a huge number of luxury short-term rental condos, I would say some folks who may not be the happiest here in town. You'll get a lot of people coming to council meetings. But I do think having dialogue with developers and investors is important. But ultimately I don't I think as a community, we have to make sure that we set the guardrails that are appropriate, and allow the private sector to, innovate within those guardrails, as they will, because you can't always rely on everybody's goodwill, so to speak.
And I think it's really important to note, people sort of seem to think that a lot of the cities or counties somehow are involved or know about every real estate deal that happens in town. If it's people coming from California or Texas or East Coast or whatever, and they're buying a home and turning it into an Airbnb, unless there's a permitting process in place to make them do a permit before they turn it into a short-term rental, the city is not involved in that real estate transaction at all, and we can't discriminate against someone whose primary address is not in the state of Montana, or is not in Park County, or is not in Livingston. We're not aware when a house sells, right? So it's often the regulations come after the sale. The city can only be really responsive to changes in land use or building on specific properties. We really can't get involved in real estate transactions at all, especially under Montana state law. So it's putting those correct standards in place or permitting processes in place that the community wants to see to regulate the actual use of land, rather than trying to stop people from buying property in town or from out of state buying property in town. Now, the state could certainly disincentivize out of state property owners through their taxation policy. And if cities had more taxation power, they're certainly disincentivizing the second home ownership through taxation. But right now, the cities have absolutely no ability to do so.
Yeah, thank you. And Steve Caldwell pointed out that most of that Park County and Livingston are not resort tax communities. Cook City and Gardner are. So that kind of can change the options that we have. And it seems like also there's just lots of things at the state level that make it hard to regulate this as well. So it's kind of, it seems like there's a lot to learn and a lot of different things. I know we kind of went over that a lot in the housing action or housing working group discussions and things like that. I've seen a lot of comments from people in this chat, but not a lot of questions. I guess, let's see. Is something like worker housing incentives or putting deed restrictions to kind of help keep something as a long-term rental? I mean, is that something that Whitefish has thought about doing? Is that something that kind of works with the short-term rental regulations, or are those kind of separate pots? How do you think about that?
They're kind of separate in my mind. I mean, the answer is we absolutely think about that all the time. In fact, Whitefish had a program up until a year and a half ago or a year ago that required 20% of every development to have deed restricted affordable housing in it, which was unfortunately repealed by the state legislature. So, I do think in my mind, those are somewhat separate, efforts. I mean, when we talk about deed restricted housing, typically we talk about trying to create housing that is meeting a need that the private sector is not able to meet on their own. So whether it's price points or whatever. And so, we do have various efforts in place to produce more of that. And I could go on about that for hours, but, the short-term rental conversation tends to be, focused on making sure that the short-term rentals do not infringe upon the non-deed restricted or the open, long range ownership or rental market, and making sure again that they stay in the box that they're supposed to be in. So
we got a question from Jesse Wilcox. Could you speak more about the public messaging that other communities use to encourage people to rent long-term rather than short-term? And I don't know, Ben, if you could answer that about Whitefish, or if Matthew, you have an idea about Big Sky or Lila at other communities.
I can speak for Whitefish. I don't know that we have a lot of direct messaging in that sense, and honestly, I'm not quite sure how effective it would be if we did, but we do have what's called a Convention and Visitors Bureau here that I think there's other similar models in other communities, and we call it the CVB. Our CVB here has effectively, it was traditionally an organization who promoted tourism and promoted people visiting here. And, quite honestly, in the recent past, they've completely changed all of their messaging to not to promote tourism, but to promote sustainability. So promoting the people, both here in town, helping to keep our communities sustainable for us, and also visitors to, advice on how to visit here and how to visit here in a way that allows our community to still remain the way that it is. Because I think that's really our goal here. So.
Bay Sky is kind of, I think, a unique example. They have what's called the Bay Sky Property Owners Association, which covers a lot of properties within the city. A lot of property owners are within that association. And I know they were doing some direct marketing to their members. Basically, I wouldn't go as far as saying begging, but asking them to consider doing long-term rentals rather than short-term rentals. That program was in its infancy when I left Gallatin County, so I'm not sure how much they're doing now. But they were doing some pretty significant outreach through that. Basically, they have mailers, and when they send out their fees and things like that, they'll send it out with that, basically informing people of the benefits of doing long-term rentals rather than short-term rentals, and just trying to convince them to do more long-term rentals. So it's certainly something that large-scale organizations that have large mailing lists like that can do. It's much harder in a more fragmented place, something like Livingston or rural Park County. It's going to be very difficult to do that. That's what we call direct marketing to people, just because you don't have that overarching entity that can sort of mobilize 2,000 letters to people every quarter or whatever it is.
I would just, another reminder, I think this is a big theme, but we're all operating in different regulatory environments when we look at examples from other communities in the West and in other states, or anywhere. There's a lot of differences in the options on the table, and we're looking at what we can do the best we can with what's here. When we talk about marketing and messaging, again, we would hope that there would be an opportunity for both short-term rentals and long-term rentals. And we're not looking to completely remove all short-term rentals, just more of what that balance is. I think there's been some great points in the chat about how much money is brought in to the tourism industry, as well as balancing that with opportunities for people working in the tourism industry to be able to live. And the difference between the types of businesses that a long-term renter versus a short-term renter might be going to on a regular basis are a little bit different. And we to have a strong community, we do need all kinds. So the messaging, is most likely not anti one or the other, but helping strike that balance. And these incentives, these financial incentives are very real. If somebody's purchasing a home intended for short-term rental at today's median price, they might only be able to make their mortgage if they do a short-term rental. So thinking about what does somebody need to make an income off of their property versus if somebody's owned that home a long time and they can do it as a short-term rental for the less hassle, that could be a good opportunity to help kind of talk them into that. So it's really a balance, and it's all individual choices for our community members that own those homes right now. But it's a good question, and I'll continue to kind of gather some examples of how other communities have helped align their values around that. Matthew, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we talk a lot about short-term rentals in the negative, basically because they're already allowed and there's no regulation. So we're talking about them in the negative in that there's the potential for regulation because they're already allowed already and we already have them. But it's really important to be aware, and I sort of am going to disagree a little bit with Ben on this one. It's really important for us to be aware that a lot of the city's economic development and prosperity and income is generated. We are a tourist community and we depend a lot on tourists, and it's better, at least for the city of Livingston, to have those tourists staying in the city of Livingston than staying in West Yellowstone. Or, you know, for us, better for us to have people staying in Livingston and being at the restaurants and at the coffee shops and buying art at the art galleries and being downtown than it is for us to then go straight down the valley to Gardner, right? So there are certainly benefits to the community from short-term rentals, as there are from other lodging, because we do rely on tourism a lot. It's one of our primary industries, and that's probably not going to change in the near future. And I don't think, you know, having operated through the growth policy process, I don't think we want that to change. So I think it's really important to note that even though we do talk about, oh, these are bad, or what can we do to regulate them, there are pros and cons to them, and we talk about regulating them because they're currently unregulated, not because we just want to get rid of them. And I think that's a very important point you made.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew and Lila. And I think that's a really important distinction to think about that. And I think that's something, I mean, why Lila did the poll is to just kind of figure out what is a goal of short-term rental regulations in Park County, and what do we envision this being, and how can we have both this thing that's really beneficial to lots of community members and also preserve long-term housing for people. And I think that's just, so yeah, again, we're really hoping for feedback from people through the housing action plan process. And I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. I think I'm just going to ask Ben one last question from Steve, and then we will wrap it up, which is the Whitefish Council's goal more directed to preserving affordable housing options or toward funding the costs associated with additional visitation? Because
I would say both. I mean, you know, if you look at the impact of visitation here in town, housing is definitely one of those impacts, but it's not the only impact. I mean, our streets and roads are used way more. Our parks are used a lot more. A lot of the infrastructure here in town, property taxes are much higher. I mean, and so if you look, like, for example, we do have a resort tax, as was alluded to here, and we use a lot of those funds to pay for street development, property tax relief. We currently can't use it for affordable housing, but that's something that we may be considering more in the future. And so I think our goal, quite honestly, and I would reiterate, maybe I didn't reiterate this enough, is that it's not a moral quest against short-term rentals at all. I think that, you know, a lot of the folks here, you know, do make their living based on the tourism economy. There's nothing wrong with that at all. There's nothing wrong with short-term rentals at all. But I think that what is important for us is to understand that without our core community, where would we be? And a lot of what we're trying to do is to react to a situation that feels like it's becoming unsustainable by helping to make it sustainable, helping to make it workable for the folks who live here, who are making their livelihoods here and building their lives and their families here. And so, yeah, tourism always has its place. Visitors are always welcome here. But we do want to find ways to make it sustainable for everybody. That includes housing, and that also includes, you know, a whole host of other things that within our city government that everybody uses here in town. So.
yeah, thank you. And again, this is kind of like we're talking about. This is the point, is that we can work together to kind of build the vision for the community to help address all of these things, because Livingston has a tourist driven economy, and we just need to figure out how we can create a vision that we all as a community buy into, rather than just kind of letting the growth happen to us. So thanks, Ben. Thanks, Lila and Matthew. This was a great conversation, and I'm sure we'll be discussing this more in the coming months. And yeah, so thank you very much. The other thing, I just wanted to give one more plug. The PCEC is hosting students from the MSU architecture school tomorrow at the Lincoln School Auditorium for an event about reimagining downtown Livingston. 10 different students came up with these really great ideas about what downtown Livingston could become. And we're really hoping that community members can come to the Lincoln School Auditorium tomorrow night from 5:30 to 7:30 to hear those ideas and just discuss kind of downtown Livingston and what it can become in the coming years. So thank you, everyone. And thanks for joining us again.